Okay, Matt, a couple things that we got to put in the show notes. I'm just going to lead with that.
Okay.
I know it's just the start and everything, but a couple things we got to put in the show notes. Sacramentum Caritatis.
Yes.
All right. Pope Benedict XVI letter on the Eucharist.
On the Eucharist. Right. Sacrament of charity.
That's boom. Way to go with your Latin.
Yeah.
Okay. Romans 12:1.
Yeah.
We're going to put in the whole citation. I want to put in this quote from St. Augustine because Dr. Feingold referenced it.
Okay.
And he says, "For you, I am a bishop. With you, I am a Christian."
Okay.
Now, folks, that quote just thrown out there into the ether makes no sense at this exact moment, but we talk about it later on, so it's going to be really fun. Because today, Matthew, we had the joy of an amazing conversation with Dr. Lawerence Feingold, author of The Eucharist, Mystery of Presence, Sacrifice, and Communion. A pretty hefty tome.
It is a behemoth of a book.
Yeah, a hefty tome from.
I think let's look
academic.
at how many pages exactly.
It's a lot. It's heavy.
It's over 700.
Remember that concussion you had? If I hit you in the head with this book, it would give you another concussion.
There's no doubt about it. I don't know why I keep bringing that up.
Because it's.
It keeps finding itself applicable. It's actually only 607.
But this
not
is
as if that's not a lot.
This is a serious book, folks. It's designed really as a textbook, but I think honestly, this is a book that we could read.
Having begun, the reading process,
yeah.
also known as just reading, I would say that this is this is a book worth buying without being in a class, right? Like yeah. I skipped around in prep for the interview knowing what I wanted to talk about.
That's more than I did.
Fair enough. But
I've read nothing. I'm not proud of this, folks. I'm just saying I haven't actually read the book, but I had a blast talking to Dr. Feingold.
Yeah, this was
oh my goodness.
This was a fantastic episode. There are not many times where I had a spastic attack.
We high-fived.
We high-fived.
There was a high
mid-episode.
Yeah.
Not many high fives on the show, folks.
You can't see him anyway because this is an audio-only podcast.
Yeah.
But,
So there you go. But this is a book worth buying. This is a book worth buying.
Yeah.
Especially given what the stage of the life of the church we are in. Knowing it is the Eucharistic revival.
Right.
This is a book worth buying.
Yeah, and we made reference to it several times, but I don't know if we hammered that point quite hard enough. In this time of Eucharistic revival, one of the best things we can do is understand as much as possible the Eucharist. Yeah. Like, study it. Let's dive into what the Eucharist really is. And I loved his opening question, which was, why did Jesus give us the Eucharist? And in fact, remember we were making that joke before we started recording that I like to lead off with really, really simple questions. He did it for me. Yeah. I didn't have to. He led off with, why the Eucharist?
See, I did the wrong thing because when I was mocking you about that, I said, what is the Eucharist? Yeah, exactly. So I didn't even ask the right simple question.
But it was such a great way to start this idea of why did Jesus do this? It's the sacrament of charity to draw us into his charity. And in this phase, what is it? The second year of the 3-year process of Eucharistic revival that is going to be ongoing after that. Go back to the Father Craig Vosick episode, and he'll tell you a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of the Eucharistic revival. But here, Dr. Feingold is giving us something of the theology that's behind it all, and really, this is the understanding of what the Eucharist is, what Holy Communion is, what the Mass is, that we really need to dive into. So thrilled to have him here. I'm so glad he gave us that time.
You're going to have to listen to this one twice. That's for sure.
On single speed. I know you guys listen on double speed. I hear you.
All right. Enjoy the show.
Enjoy. Dr. Feingold, welcome to The Tangent. It's great to have you on today.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure.
So we've got your book, The Eucharist, Mystery of Presence, Sacrifice, and Communion, which is, that's a big book. This is a very, very big book.
It's in the 700s.
Yeah. Impressive, and it looks like this is, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is intended as a textbook, as a manual for sacramental theology students, correct?
Exactly, yeah. I wrote it. I teach at a seminary, Kenrick Lennon Seminary in St. Louis.
Oh.
And this has come out of teaching this class since 2012.
Wow. Okay.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
Well,
the fruit of 6 or 7 years of teaching it. And
wow.
I write course notes for all the classes I teach, but each year I try and make it better. And the students help me by asking questions and by looks of incomprehension that show me this needs a better explanation. And
so
then
when you see them confused, you know you've got to do some more.
That's a great approach.
My wife is also involved. She's my editor. And so her task is to make sure, likewise, she can understand it, and therefore the reader can understand it.
That's my wife's job. When I write papers for school, I have her read my my papers as well. Mine aren't 700 pages long.
Okay.
Now.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, usually they top out around 12 or 13.
That's great. Well, please say hello to Father Shane Demon and to
will
Father
do.
Jason Schumer.
Okay.
I was with those guys at the NAC.
In fact, I
seminary.
teach this course with Father Schumer.
Oh, really?
I do 2/3 of it, the first part on the dogmatic sacramental theology, and then he does the liturgical theology.
Beautiful. Oh, I love that idea. I love that combination. Now, that's an important point. So when we talk about the Eucharist, and here we're in the midst of the Eucharistic revival, and so this is a great time for us to be talking about the Eucharist and to be getting into some of the theology that's behind it, but it's hard to separate the theology, the sacramental theology, from the liturgical aspect of it, even though we can make the distinctions. But I mean, when is it that we encounter the Eucharist most of all as Catholics? It's at Mass.
Right, exactly.
That's the place where we're most likely to encounter the Eucharist. If you have been introduced to things like Eucharistic adoration, you have an adoration chapel readily available to you. You might stop in for visits. But our main point of contact with the Eucharist is in the context of Mass. So having that liturgical component, I think that sounds like a really interesting way to approach the course.
Can I butt in there? So
of course.
My goal in teaching this is so that the seminarians and all lay people, all lay Catholics who want to read it, can experience Mass more profoundly, right? And then the seminarians offer Mass in the future with a deeper entrance into the mystery. Right? It always remains mystery, but we can go deeper into that mystery, and that's the purpose of this book and the corresponding course that's at Emmaus Academic.
I was teaching a course on ecclesiology once, and it was to our permanent deacon class. So these are the guys preparing for permanent diaconate, and one of them asked me at one point in one of the classes, he said, "Father, this is all great, but how are we supposed to talk about this in a homily?" And I said, "Well, you're not." And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, this particular stuff that we're talking about, this isn't homily material. This would be boring. You'd lose people's interest. But this is the foundational stuff. This is the stuff that is everything that you're going to preach about, especially when the subject of the church comes up, when we need to talk about how the Holy Spirit guides the church and does these things. This is foundational knowledge for how all of those other things that you will preach about are going to go into it."
Right.
When you're teaching these courses on the Eucharist, where do you see the applicability most of all for homiletics versus the stuff that you need to know about this, but this probably isn't going to come up in your average Sunday Mass homily?
Actually, I do hope very much that this will come up in their Sunday Mass homilies. That's my dream. And in fact, that's the way, you don't have to know this to read the book, but at the end of every chapter, there's a series of study questions. And my idea for them is that they provoke thought, but for the future priests, they can also serve as things to explain in preaching. And so my exams for the seminarians are all oral exams in which they basically preach or teach an adult faith formation on, say, why did Jesus institute the Eucharist? The real presence, the sacrifice of the Mass, etc. How it's prefigured in the Old Testament. So I very much think it needs to be preached, the Eucharist, and it needs to be preached in a way that's always looking at the why question. Why did Jesus institute it? And that means, how is this coming out of Jesus's love for me and for his church as the bridegroom? And so basically that's the way this whole book and the whole course is centered. So I start in the first chapter with, why did Jesus institute the Eucharist? And in order to understand that question, we have to think of Jesus as the bridegroom. And therefore, the Eucharist is the sacrament of the love of Jesus, the bridegroom. And so that's a traditional name for the Eucharist is Sacrament of Charity. And Pope Benedict wrote a beautiful apostolic exhortation with that title, Sacrament of Charity. And so thinking of the charity spousal love helps us to understand how do spouses express love? Well, spouses share life together, right? So that's a first fundamental reason for the Eucharist. Jesus, and that's a reason for the incarnation, right? He took our flesh and our life so as to share life with us. But he ascended out of this world 1990 years ago, right? With his visible, tangible flesh. And so the Eucharist is reflecting that desire of the bridegroom to continue to dwell with us, and in fact, in a better way, in a way here with us wherever his bride is. I'm at my office at the seminary, and just down the hall and up the stairs is Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament, right? And it's easy to take that for granted for us Catholics, right? But that's a key part of the bridegroom's desire to be encountered. But it's not all. Spousal love involves sacrifice, right? As anybody who's married knows, marital love involves sacrificing oneself far more than one ever, dreamed of in making the marriage vows. And that's the glory of marriage, is that all of those opportunities that the Lord gives us to sacrifice ourselves for our beloved spouse and children. And so, likewise, the Eucharist, it makes sense, is also his sacrifice. But his sacrifice made available to us so that we can participate in it. So that we can offer to his Father the same sacrifice that he offered 2,000 years ago, made present in mystery. And then a third thing that's spousal love, the culminating thing, is total self-gift to one's spouse, right? And of course, we spouses can't do that perfectly, right? That's what marriage is about, but we fall short. And Jesus instituted the Eucharist so that it could be a total gift of self to each one of the members of his bride, the church, right? And that's the mystery of Holy Communion. So that's how I structure the book, presence, sacrifice, and communion, as responding to the why question, and as three aspects of Christ's spousal love as the bridegroom.
I love that idea of going into the why. Why did Jesus do this? I think very often we know that Jesus did this. Mm-hmm. At Mass, this is what Jesus did. We're gonna tell you what the Lord did. This is how he did it. These are the words that he spoke. And in fact, we know that during Mass he's doing it. He is really offering himself to us at every Mass. But this idea of why did Jesus do this and bringing it into that context of spousal love is very powerful, because then you're right, it becomes that model for all spousal love.
Right.
Every spouse, every human being is called into this. It's not only those who are married, because obviously a priest is called also to make the total gift of self. Religious is called those in consecrated life called to make that total gift of self. But here we see the why. Why? Because we cannot make that total gift on our own. We certainly cannot do it perfectly, but here's the model. Here's the way, and then here's also the strength that will be necessary. Here's the gift, the sacramental grace that will be needed for us to make that gift.
It's scriptural too, because Ephesians 5 is love your wife the way Christ loved the church.
Right.
Right, and so you see that connection with the sacrificial element, in the Eucharist and in the spousal love that Christ. Oh, I guess St. Paul through Christ, right? But St. Paul instructed, for us to follow. So it's very interesting. Something that struck me when I was reading through this was the concept of participation. Now, I know that participation. So I was reading chapter 7, which is the Protestant objections.
Okay.
And it seemed like underlying all of it was just that they don't recognize that we are called to participate in salvation.
Right.
But really, it jogged my thoughts to, well, how do I, as a layperson, right, who's sitting in the pew and standing and kneeling, how do I participate in the holy sacrifice of the Mass, right? Because obviously my role is so different, right, than fathers here. But even, you're instructing seminarians, right? But what would you say to a layperson?
Yeah, I would say the same thing. So I have a chapter. So here, let me lay this out. I have a chapter on this. It's chapter 10 in the book.
Okay.
And in the course on Emmaus Academic, there's a talk. One of
Read
the
the whole
talks
book
is on
next
that.
time, Matt.
And so, yes, obviously there's a difference in the two priesthoods. There's
Right.
the ministerial priesthood and the common priesthood.
Mm-hmm.
And the ministerial priest alone is offering in the person of Christ. And the common priesthood is offering in the person of the bride. All right, so yes, that's a non-negotiable difference that the Second Vatican Council lays out beautifully in Lumen Gentium 10. Am I getting that wrong? But what we're offering is the same Jesus, priest and people. And so the Second Vatican Council, in numerous documents, lays out precisely this charge. So the most famous text is Lumen Gentium 11. That's the most quoted text, I think, from the Second Vatican Council that speaks of the Eucharist as source and summit. And then it goes on, so that all the lay faithful are to offer Christ to the Father and themselves with him. And in another document on the priesthood, Presbyterorum Ordinis 5, so the document on priests, it says that priests have a profound duty to instruct the faithful precisely about this, that their role to offer God the Son to God the Father in the Mass and to offer ourselves with him. So what's that about? At first hearing, that might sound totally strange. And
I know that the first time I had ever heard something like this, I think it was fairly daunting.
Yeah.
Wait, what do you mean I'm supposed to offer myself with Christ?
Yeah, it's a tall order.
Right.
But he's anyway.
But I think most of the faithful, if you tell them that, they're going to say, "What?
Right.
I've never heard that before." And so Vatican II gave that as a charge to all priests to instruct. So I'm taking this back to preaching on the Eucharist. I think that needs to be preached on much more than it is, because this enables me to bring, to make Mass not just 1 hour on Sunday morning, but to make the whole of my life Eucharistic. I think that's gigantic. And this is, I think, what we ought to be aiming at in the Eucharistic revival. And of course, the Eucharistic revival can't just be 1 year or 2 years, right? It's got to be something that the church does always. But it will set our sights too low, I think, if we just focus on something as fundamental as the real presence, as fundamental as that is. But we want to also bring to it the idea of a Eucharistic life or Eucharistic spirituality. Let me take this a step back. So it goes back to what we were saying about spousal love involving sacrifice. All right, so Jesus instituted the Eucharist, I think, again, not by chance, but the night before he made his sacrifice for his bride, right? Precisely so that gift of self to the Father for us wouldn't simply pass into history, but before he offered it, he found a way of giving it to us, his bride, so that we can live it and make it our way of relating to the Father every day of our lives. All right, so the Mass is Christ's gift of his sacrifice to his bride. All right, if Christ is giving that sacrifice to his bride, he's giving it so that all the members of his bride can join in his offering. All right. But so that'd be the first part of that. So we're called to offer him to the Father. And I like to think, what does that mean to offer Jesus to the Father? I mean, it means, I think, above all, to thank him for offering himself for me and for everyone. And so that's the very name Eucharist means thanksgiving.
Right.
Right. And so we're offering it to the Father. So the priest alone is offering in the person of Christ. Right. We're offering in the person of the bride, thanking our head for giving himself for us to the Father on Calvary and for letting us join in it in this sense. So actually on Good Friday, Mary was there, right? And John was there. And we know maybe John wasn't entirely realizing what was going on, but Mary did, right? She was there at the foot of the cross, understanding what was happening, that her son wasn't merely, being executed, but was offering himself to the Father for the redemption of the world. And therefore she stood there co-offering, right? So going back to what you said earlier about this having to do with, so Protestant objections not realizing the role of our cooperation. All right, on Calvary, there was a principal offerer, Jesus, our head, and there was a co-offerer, Mary, his mother, and then a less perfect co-offerer, John, right, and Mary Magdalene and Mary of Clopas, and Mary. So Jesus wants Mary is the model of the church and the mother of the church, and what she was doing on Calvary as our mother, he wants us to do as well, right? To stand at the foot of the cross and to offer him to the Father, right? But we weren't there, right? And so the Eucharist is, we could say, the answer to a kind of a divine problem that only the divine wisdom could resolve. And that is how some event that takes place on one particular day in the middle of human history could be an event that all of us could participate in as if we were there, right? And the Mass gives us this opportunity to be there like Mary. Now notice, Mary was doing two things without thinking about it. She was only thinking about one thing, and that was her son's sacrifice, right? Which she was co-offering to the Father by thanking him for having not come down from the cross, right? As he was tempted to do by the bystanders, right? If you're really the Son of God, come down from the cross, right? And so he doesn't come down. And she was offering that sacrifice with him. And of course, that meant that she was offering herself because he was her whole life, right? So Mary's heart was offered with her son's offering, right? Because she loved him as no one else could, being his mother, right? And the perfect mother of such a son. So we can't enter into that, right? I can't do that at Mass, but I'm called to try to do that, right? As is each one of us. And so she simultaneously offered her son to the Father and herself with him. And we need to do the same, right? So if I go to Mass and I'm offering Jesus to the Father, how could I not offer my desires, my hopes, my dreams, my loves, my very recognition of my insufficiency, right? In other words, all of what's wanting, and my desire that. So we offer our hearts with him, and that makes sense because he's the head of the mystical body, and we're the pinky or the little toe, right, of his body, and Jesus doesn't want to be offered in the Mass as a decapitated head. He wants to be offered by the whole body himself. So again, that's where it's not enough that the ministerial priest, it's absolutely essential. Without the ministerial priest, there's no Mass, right? Because there would be no one speaking in the person of Christ. But without the body present, it would be an incomplete offering, a severed head.
Right.
It seems to me that's the key too, like recognizing that we are the mystical body of Christ. because we are the mystical body of Christ, which Christ himself calls us, Paul, I don't know if he actually fell off a horse. People love to say that Paul fell off a horse, but there's no horse in the actual scriptures, my understanding.
Yeah.
Right? But
he was just going
Jesus,
to Damascus.
He could have been walking, is the point.
Exactly.
But the real point, actually, is that Jesus says, Paul, why are you persecuting me? Right? So Jesus is the one who has associated himself with us. Like, this isn't something that we said, hey, look, we're the mystical body of Christ, therefore we must offer ourselves with him. It's that Jesus associated himself with me, right? And if he associated himself with me, that means I have been drawn into him, and like it's kind of like it completely follows that I have to be offered with him if I want to have that communion with him. It's like the natural next step, that, and I think even further, because you're sitting here and it's like you're preaching a homily. It's great, right?
We'll take it.
Yeah, I needed one.
Yeah.
But I'm saying to myself, this is so hard because it demands that I conform myself to him. I'm feeling challenged.
Okay.
Saying like, this is so difficult. I now at Mass, I have to I'm going to offer him it all, and it's not going to come close, but I sure as heck got to try and resemble him.
Yeah, right.
That's right.
So,
well, and I think the posture of Mary is so important because Mary, at the foot of the cross, she is interiorly completely focused on Jesus, who is her whole life, who is her whole world, exactly like you said. But then her posture is one of presence. She's there. She doesn't move from the foot of the cross. And she's adoring. And so she's and then I guess we could add a third, that she's listening, because it's from the cross that Jesus addresses her, woman, behold your son, behold your mother. So she's present. She showed up. And then she adores Jesus. And then she also is able to hear his voice as he speaks to her from the cross, which I think is actually the fundamental part. When the Second Vatican Council talks about full, conscious, and active participation of all the faithful, full, conscious, and active participation and this has been said thousands and thousands of times by people much more eloquent than I am, but that doesn't mean doing stuff. Full, conscious, active participation doesn't mean that you have like a special job or a special task assigned to you. Full, conscious, and active participation means that you are present, you are adoring, and you are listening to what it is that Jesus wants to give to you. And then look at John. I think John's the other great example, because it's hard to try to imitate the Blessed Mother, immaculately conceived, never sinned. It's hard, right?
I'm just saying there's an unfair advantage.
Exactly. But there's John at the foot of the cross. And when Jesus says, son, behold your mother, he takes her into his home.
Right.
And so he takes into his home for the rest of his life the one who gave us Christ. He takes into his home and therefore into his own heart that bond of filial relationship. Mm-hmm. And then there's that mystical way in which he's also then participating in what Christ is offering. So there's this entering into something completely different by virtue of him also being present at the cross, at the foot of the cross. And I think that's such an important thing for us to understand as we go to Mass. Dr. Feingold, as you're talking about the importance of the faithful being present, the body, you're bringing to mind for me the experience of celebrating Mass during the quarantine portion of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And so live streaming a Mass every day for an empty chapel. And not being allowed to have people there.
Right. That must be no fun.
It was no fun at all. And I say Mass on my own every once in a while. Mm-hmm. If I don't have a scheduled public Mass mm-hmm. or a funeral, I don't mind celebrating a private Mass. Right. In fact, sometimes a private Mass can be very, very peaceful mm-hmm. and almost a relief. I don't have to give a homily. I'm not going to preach to myself. I don't want to hear myself. I hear myself enough. But there can be a real gift in stepping into that private Mass. But then in other ways, there's something missing.
Right.
And so maybe after those first 2 weeks, they told us 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and that didn't happen. And so there we are going into the second month of mm-hmm. Mass with no congregation, just a camera in front of me as I'm at the altar. And I remember just having this one day where I don't want this.
Right.
And it was hard to actually go up to the altar that day. I didn't want to do it because I was just so tired of saying Mass for no one. And then God gave me this gift the next day. When I went into the chapel, there were these two people who I knew, and they were sitting in the back, and they're a married couple, and they're sitting in the back. And I was like, I'm not supposed to have anybody here. And they said, can we please stay? I said, you can stay as long as you don't make any noise. Don't say any of the responses. And so I said Mass, and they stayed for Mass, and then they left. And it was the greatest thing to have these two people sitting in the back of the church, like just quietly there. But it was finally, I had a congregation. I wasn't supposed to,
right.
And I'm now admitting it freely because I just don't care anymore. But
Yeah.
I stopped caring. But it was a really difficult time, and I think we don't need to give criticisms too much here. I think the Cardinal Dolan very beautifully said that he's looking back at all of the pandemic restrictions and everything and regretting a lot of that.
Right.
That we kept people away from the Mass, and I think he's absolutely right. I fully regret everything that we had to do for that we didn't have people at Mass, and that for such a long time that was prevented. But I think about it did two things, I think, for my own approach to the Mass. First, there was that pain of just not having anybody, but it made me appreciate more the value of the congregation. Like, I came to a much deeper sense of why it matters to have people for whom I am celebrating the Mass, who are physically present. Every Mass has an intention, so I'm celebrating Mass for something, but to have people really there and knowing that they're sharing in the graces, that has become a much greater value for me, and I appreciate that. The other thing it did was it made me never, ever want to give up my role as the priest of distributing communion.
Uh-huh.
I am very jealous of that responsibility now, far
Beautiful.
more than I was before. And so I will, at my parish, we distribute communion, the priest or the deacon together, and that's it. And I will not go back to, when I was first.
Yeah, I think that's excellent.
When I was first ordained in the parish, sometimes if there was an extra, it's going to sound bad, an extra extraordinary minister, the priest would just sit out and let them distribute. I'm like, no. For 3 months, I wasn't allowed to give communion to anybody. That will be the only time for the rest of my life that I'm not giving communion. But I have to do this, and I think that was where we're talking about that spousal union, right? Of bride and bridegroom, as the priest, as the one who has to act in the person of Christ. I realized I cannot fail to offer. And when I'm offering the Eucharist, when I'm giving people communion, there's a way in which I think, and maybe we could talk about this a little bit. When the priest distributes communion, so there's the offering that he makes acting in persona Christi. Is there a way that as the priest is giving the body of Christ to the people in Holy Communion, that it's not only Christ the bridegroom giving himself to the people, but could there also be a way in which the priest as pastor, as shepherd, is not in the same way, but somehow giving himself to the people also?
Yeah, absolutely. Pope Francis has spoken about that in Desiderio Desideravi. I don't have the quote present in my mind. All right. But yeah, he has a beautiful reflection.
Mark, that is the first time I ever accidentally quoted Pope Francis.
Yeah, it's a beautiful reflection. Precisely, he's speaking about priestly spirituality. And how that priestly spirituality is configuration with Christ in the whole of his self-giving. And therefore, that includes giving of communion and your giving of yourself, right, to your parish, to the people of God. So absolutely, I would agree. I'd like to go back a little, if I could, to what you said before that.
Of course.
So yeah, I had a similar experience during coronavirus time of watching Mass on the computer in our basement, and we set up a little God corner in the basement. And so a crucifix in the corner with a kneeler, Word of God, and live stream Mass. But so here's the problem. That Jesus instituted the Eucharist so that our encounter, right, with Jesus and his Father would not just be in my God corner, right? But he instituted the Eucharist so that we could enter into his self-gift with a presence, right? So that's that first piece: presence, sacrifice, and communion. And the presence is the foundation of the other two, right? And so it's not the same. Yes, if Jesus hadn't instituted the Eucharist, all of the faithful should do everything they do for the glory of God. Right? Today's Feast of St. Ignatius. So whether you eat or drink, do it for the glory of God. And that I can do in my God corner, my basement. But what I can't do in my basement is offer myself in physical presence of Jesus' self-offering, as Mary did standing at the foot of the cross, right? It's not the same, Mary at the foot of the cross or Peter, I don't know, in his house or something.
Right.
And so that presence enables this self-offering to, again, it's head and members together, right? And that's so beautiful. And this is why it needs to involve a parish, so that it be head and members not isolated as islands, but members precisely as an ecclesial communion. Right. And again, that's really beautiful. And we're living in an individualistic society. We tend not to see that. To offer myself with all of the other members, and we complement each other, right? Because what each one offers, insofar, right, as I'm offering myself as the pinky, I need the other fingers, I need the legs and the feet. And so each of us offer our particular gift that nobody else can give, which is our particular life, our personality, our temperament, our situation, our weaknesses, right, our failings, as well as our dreams and hopes and desires. And everyone complements one another in the mystical bride, right? And so it's so beautiful that we do that together and not just separately, and that we do it above all together with Jesus, right, who's made present at the altar. So I think there was and so that would be the first and most important thing, glorifying the Father. But then there's a second thing, and that is, it's reasonable to think that more graces come down. So every Mass is offered for the whole world, right? It's offered for the intention that you offer it for, right? That particular intention. Mm-hmm. But it also for all of those who are participating in the offering, right? And that's the ministerial priest and all of the lay faithful who are present as in their common priesthood, and then for all of their intentions, right? And therefore, if I'm present at Mass, participating with that full, active, conscious participation that we spoke about, it's reasonable to think more fruits of grace are going to come down to the world, right? So if it's just you, Father, yes, that's magnificent. It still is being offered for the whole world, and grace is coming to the whole world because of that offering. But if I'm there too, and you're there, and Matt, and all of us in the parish are there, far more graces, because we're all going to be bringing the desires of our heart, and Jesus won't leave that unanswered. The Father won't leave that unanswered, right? And so, insofar as Mass attendance is restricted, either in coronavirus because of health reasons, or simply because of laziness, I'm not there because I'm watching football or something. The whole world is not receiving a grace. Now, at first sight, that might seem crazy, right? Because God wants to give grace more than I want him to give grace. Why would he make his graces dependent on our participating? But we should think, yes, because he's made us real participants and cooperators.
Yeah. The grace is not less. The grace is offered. But for me to receive it, I have to show up. I have to want the grace. But if I don't show up, if I don't want the grace, then the grace is there. It's waiting for me. But I'm just holding back for whatever. Maybe I just don't feel like it or something.
Right. But
how can I receive that grace?
Sorry. But the beauty of the Mass is different than other sacraments. So baptism only benefits the baptized, right? The grace of baptism. But because the Eucharist is sacrament and sacrifice, right? So Holy Communion is going to benefit those who receive it. But the sacrifice of the Mass is offered for the whole world, right? And so that's going to benefit the whole world. But it's reasonable if I'm participant, right? If I'm there like Mary at the foot of the cross. So Mary's maternity was enlarged, right? That's So when Jesus said to her, woman, behold your son, right? And we see ourselves included there, right? Her maternity was enlarged to the whole world. And so our being present in the offering enables us to enlarge our spiritual fatherhood, right, if we're men, or spiritual motherhood, if we're women. And so this is, we're just used to thinking of Sunday Mass obligation as if it's some obligation, right, that the church is imposing on me. But it's the Sunday Mass glory, right? It's the Sunday Mass unthinkable privilege of being able to join in the offering of Calvary, of the sacrifice on Calvary for the whole world and for the glory of the Father.
Yeah. And so then if the Eucharist, the Mass in particular, benefits far more than just the individual receiving communion, but benefits really, truly the whole world, that grace is given. We might look at something like holy orders, the sacrament of holy orders. It's going to benefit the world because this priest now has been sent out to do this, but it's not quite the same until that priest has said Mass, right? And then it's because there's a priest who can say Mass, but it's still the Mass that's the source through which that's being offered, because the individual priest doesn't really matter. It could be me saying Mass, it could be the bishop saying Mass, it could be some other priest saying Mass. As long as a priest is saying Mass, the Mass is happening. The graces of the Mass are happening. That gift of grace is being poured out. But then as you're talking about this, that there's a participation in it. There's a way that love of God is being manifested to the world then through the people who have received, through the people who have been present, who are there.
Right.
Then,
through the people who are co-offering.
Yes, exactly. So then that capacity for love, that capacity for grace, for maternity, for paternity, these things are enlarged and given more. Then it would seem like marriage then becomes the other sacrament by which we can see that grace being poured out to the world in such a powerful way. Right? In the sacrament of marriage, as husband and wife become a living witness. Matt, you and Renee, you guys are the living embodiment of the Eucharist then. No pressure, just so you know.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Right. Yeah, so Pope Benedict makes that connection in Sacramentum Caritatis between the Eucharist and living marriage. And that's why, again, marriage and the Eucharist are two mysteries that go so intimately together. Well, let me pick up one more thing. So it seems to me there was a lost opportunity, a lost teaching moment during the pandemic. And it was, we spoke to the faithful. So there was a positive thing. We spoke to the faithful about spiritual communion, right? And a lot of people had never heard that phrase. And now it's become something that people are familiar with, which is great. But there's something that we didn't say, and that is spiritual offering. And that is the Mass isn't just a receiving, but it involves two directions. Ascending and descending. So the ascending is joining in the offering, and the descending is receiving Jesus in Holy Communion. And so the Mass is the union of those two in a kind of dynamic way. And so it's not just making a spiritual communion of wanting to receive Jesus. That's great, absolutely. But even first, I want to offer myself. But the problem is I realize it's my poor self, right? Like you were saying before, Matt, that's intimidating. And so that's why the two have to go together. Yes, I offer my poor self and I receive him so that I can be strengthened in living the Christian life so that I can offer myself better next week and throughout life. And so, I think we need, it's part of, many people probably say this if they pray a morning offering.
Yeah.
But they don't realize it, right? And part of that more offering is offering oneself and all one's, right? It's joys and difficulties.
Joys, work, sufferings, and joy, work, suffering, and prayers. Is it prayers?
Yeah, and we can just put in everything in the Christian life.
Yeah.
In union with all the masses being offered in the world. And and that's good to do in the morning when you wake up, but it's even better to do it if you're present at Mass, right? That's the meaning, the most profound meaning of our full participation, because it's full. So it can't be a full participation if my participation is just being a lector. That's a great thing, right? But that's not full, because that doesn't involve the whole of my life.
Right.
And so it only is full if I'm bringing the whole of my life. Pope Benedict has a whole section of his document on the Eucharist, Sacramentum Caritatis, on this. It's the third part. So it's a beautiful document from 2007. And the first part is the mystery, kind of the dogma, what we believe in about the Eucharist. The second part is the celebration. But the third part is how do we live it? And I think that's what we need to focus on in a Eucharistic revival. How can I live this? And so he spends a lot of time speaking about bringing one's whole life to the Eucharist. And he quotes St. Paul, Romans 12:1, which speaks of, so St. Paul exhorts us, he exhorts the Romans, but obviously all Christians, to offer our bodies as a spiritual sacrifice. Offer your body, he says. And so obviously there's a connection between my body and Christ's body being offered in the Eucharist, right? And again, he's the head of a mystical body that includes me and you. And so the Fathers' Church loved that line from Romans, and they connect it with our royal priesthood, right? And so we've been given this charge to offer our body. So what does that mean, to offer my body? Well, Pope Benedict says it means all that I do in my body. And that is precisely a worship that's not disincarnate, right? That's not merely angelic, but a worship that involves our joys as well as our struggles, right? The whole fabric of Christian life. And so our prayers, our works. So my professional work, all right, for me, that might be easier because my professional work is theology and teaching seminaries, but it applies to all work, right? Precisely because work has a sacrificial dimension after the fall. And that can be really helpful to think of, I'm doing this and I'm putting it on the altar. I think we need to use our imagination here, right? To help the faithful imagine. So I like to imagine putting stuff on the altar and piling up and thinking it's not going to break no matter how much I put there. But the problem is I don't put enough, right? Wow. And I think most of us, we don't put enough. And we want to put, our work, our joys, but even our dreams for so many other people.
In his book, Priest for the Third Millennium, Cardinal Dolan shares a story about when he was a young priest in St. Louis. He was asked to give a conference to a men's group or something, and it snowed the night of the conference, and only 4 guys showed up. But he gave the talk anyway, and then a couple years later, he gets called from another parish that he was at. He gets called to the hospital. He goes to the hospital, and there's a man there whose wife is dying, and he anoints the woman as she's dying, and he's talking to her husband, who said, "Well, Father, every day I go to Mass and I place her on the paten with the host that the priest is offering." And so I just put her there on the paten. And Dolan said, "That's such a beautiful idea. How did you ever come to that? Because you're absolutely right. That's what we have to do. That's how we join our offerings to the Mass. How did you do that?" He goes, "Well, I was at that talk that you gave in the snowstorm." He said he had no recollection of ever seeing this man before in his entire life. And this talk that he gave to 4 people made this huge impact on him, that this man in a moment of real need was able to offer his wife. But that, I think that idea of, we all have something to offer. We all have something that we can give. Right.
Only that man could have offered his love for his spouse, right? Because that's his personal.
Exactly. It's the gift that only he can offer. It's the thing that only he can pray about.
That's why it's Colossians 1:24 that Paul rejoices in his sufferings, because he's making up for what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ.
Yeah.
Right. Because this is what only that man can offer.
Right.
That's right. It's what's most personal.
What's lacking in Christ's suffering? Mine. From me.
Right. Yeah. Do you guys know Downton Abbey? Are you familiar with the Downton Abbey show here? Okay. So
I'm not. Don't spoil it. I'm only on like season 3.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh, man. Okay, spoil it.
I'm even because I'm sorry.
Further behind.
This show it's been out for long enough that you should have caught up.
Yeah,
on it.
You're right.
There's this beautiful scene where
La 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 la. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
No, there's a servant who enlists in the army during World War I. He's killed in action, or he dies as a result of injuries sustained in a battle. But just before he dies, he marries one of his fellow servants.
I already know this story.
He wants to marry her, so he marries Daisy, and then his father starts coming around and wants to have a connection with Daisy. This young man's father wants to make sure that she's taken care of, wants to make sure that she has, that he has a relationship, because he said, my son loved you and I don't have him here anymore, but he loved you. And so I want to share in that. I want to help take care of you. I want to be here for you. And she visits him one day and they're having this conversation, and she says, I don't understand why you care so much. And he said, well, I don't have anybody left in my life. And if I don't have you, I'll have no one to pray for.
Wow.
It's this beautiful line in a show that is not especially religious.
Yeah, it's not.
You know, in fact, there's another scene where one of the rich ladies is caught praying in her room. She kneels down by her bed and she's praying, and her sister walks in the room and says, were you praying? Like it's a mocking thing. But here he says, if I don't have you in my life, who would I pray for? I don't have anybody else. Who will I pray for? And then to realize that, there's something that I alone can offer on behalf of the people in my life. You know, when I go to the altar and when I pray, I'm the only one who can pray for this person in that way. Right. Only you can pray for Renee the way that you would pray for her as her husband, because you're the only husband she has.
Right, or my son as his father.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
Right, and and my understanding, there's a special father blessing, right? It's it sounds legalistic, but it's not. You know, it's
no, because that's a relationship that God has brought about in us.
Yeah.
So something that, and this is going back approximately 20 minutes, something that
rewind, folks, just so you refresh your memory about what we were talking about.
We're talking about Mary underneath the cross. And so the question that I originally wanted to ask was, what role does Marian devotion play in Eucharistic devotion? So feel free to answer that as well. But what I really want to ask is, what role does consecration to Jesus through Mary, play in offering things to Jesus?
Fantastic. That is a great question. Yeah, so let me obviously the two dimensions go
they're
so well together. Right, they're
connected.
Typically Catholic devotions, right? To Mary and to the Eucharist. And they can't just be these two separate things. They're intimately connected, and we see that above all by Mary at the foot of the cross. And then another thing we can think is Mary's life after Pentecost. What would it have been like, right? Tradition speaks of her going to Ephesus with John. Well, that didn't happen right away. She might have lived some 20 years after Jesus ascended into heaven. What was her life like? It would have been a Eucharistic life. In other words, so she's the model of what it means to have full, active, conscious participation in the Eucharist, right? She's I
don't think I've ever thought about Mary going to Mass.
Well, yeah, we should.
I've never thought of. Oh my goodness, I love this idea.
Yeah, we're going back and forth in our chairs right now. I don't know if you can.
Can you imagine being the priest who has to say Mass for the Blessed Mother?
Yeah, John. Right. So again, how this would have helped John to be able to write his gospel.
Yeah.
Right. Celebrating the Eucharist with Mary every day, right, of their lives.
Wow.
Yeah, that is spectacular. So John Paul II has, this is not my thought, John Paul II makes this the conclusion of his Ecclesia de Eucharistia. And Pope Benedict likewise ends with it. She's the model at the end of Pope Benedict's Sacramentum Caritatis of living the Eucharistic life. And it's precise. So John Paul II kind of fleshes out. What would she have received when she received communion? Right, as John is celebrating the Mass. The same Jesus that she received at the Incarnation. Right, and as he was 9 months in her womb, all right, he's only 10 minutes in her every communion. But it's the same Jesus, the same heart that beat in unison with hers during the 9 months of her pregnancy. But even more, she would have been offering the same sacrifice she offered on Good Friday. right? She offering the same, and so she would have been reliving the Annunciation and Good Friday
All at
in
once.
every Mass.
Wow.
And of course, she would be receiving her glorious Son. And so she would have been reliving Easter Sunday in every Mass. Right? And we could throw the Ascension in there too, right? She's receiving her glorious Son who's ascended to the right hand of the Father. And so the Eucharist contains all the mysteries of Christ's life because it's himself, right? It's Jesus himself. And Mary would have been reliving all of those mysteries. And so we can see immediately the connection, say, with praying the rosary and living that devotion to the rosary, right? Which centers looking at the mysteries of Jesus' life precisely from Mary's point of view. Again, John Paul II has a marvelous document on the rosary where he speaks of praying the rosary that way, right? As living it, the mysteries seen through Mary's eyes, right? And that's a beautiful way, I think, of going to Mass. Wanting to ask Mary spiritually, again, use our imagination, ask Mary to come to Mass with me and to sit next to her and to share in her participation. All right. Going back to your question about the consecration, so I think there's a beautiful connection there with what Pope Benedict develops in that third part of Sacramentum Caritatis, living the Eucharistic life. So living the Eucharistic life is wanting to live my life in such a way that I can bring it and put it on the altar. And I know I can't, right? Because I can in many things, but in other things I can't because I can bring everything. So Pope Benedict highlights, there's nothing authentically human that can't be brought to the altar. All right, but sin isn't authentically human. But sin provides a great occasion. The best occasion, actually, for bringing something. And that is bringing a humble
Repentance.
contrition.
Yeah.
And a desire, right? A desire to be fed and nourished so that I can live more fully. And so that's actually the best occasion to bring. Anyway, and so all of that matches on to what does it mean to live consecration to Mary, right? Because the way I understand St. Louis de Montfort's consecration is I'm handing over to her my life in the sense that she knows better how to live. And therefore, I ought to be asking myself when I do something, asking her directly, Mary, what would you say? I'm buying a house. Which house do you like better? That means, is this house too grand for you? Or if I'm buying a car, would you feel comfortable riding with me in this car? Or is this too fancy? Or maybe too dangerous or something? And et cetera. Doing my work. Is this how you want me to do it? Cleaning my room, my house, my study, and so thinking that way is the same as thinking about doing my life, living my life so that I can offer it, because that's how she lived, right? And that's how she wants to teach me to live my own life in such a way that it's more offerable and can be inserted into her Son's offering.
I like that
Yes,
phrase.
that was a
More
fantastic
offerable.
question.
Does she offer anything for me?
Well, sure. Doesn't.
I guess
Sure.
she co-offered underneath the cross, right?
That's right.
But so if I I've heard this example given. It's like I've done a Marian consecration before, right? Cards on the table. I've done a Marian consecration.
Same.
And it's kind of like the way I heard it described was it's like as if I only had a half-eaten apple to offer to Christ. But before I offer Christ my apple that is half-eaten, and the reason I haven't eaten the other half is because there's a worm in it, I give it to Mary, and she puts it on a golden platter and surrounds it with other fruit. And then that's what gets offered to Christ. Right? So it's kind of like this, I don't know, elevation or,
But
making it more beautiful. But that's the thing. It's like, I'm not totally sure. I don't know if I've ever lived it that way because, in a sense, that didn't really make sense to me.
yeah. So I think that falls short, right? Because consecration has got to be about having her teach me how my apple can be a better apple.
Right.
With less worms in it. Right? That's the whole
Right.
point of it. But yes, that's not to say that that's not happening. So it's a
Right.
both and. And so the
Okay.
fact that Mary's offering it with me and her
Right.
offering is more pleasing makes it That's precisely what we were talking about earlier when we
Right.
were talking about offering our life, not just in my God corner by myself.
Mm-hmm. That's
but
the
offering
communion
my
of
life
saints.
with Jesus and the
Right.
whole parish with
Right.
Jesus.
Right.
Right. And so she's pointing to the Eucharist. In other words, that idea in the Marian consecration, I think, is pointing to this bigger thing of offering my life Eucharistically. And Marian consecration ought to help me in the Eucharistic life.
That image, though, it resonates. Like, I look at the story of Our Lady of Guadalupe and Juan Diego, and when he goes and he finds the roses that she has that she has provided, he starts picking them up and just rolling them up in his tilma, and she stops him.
Yeah.
The story is that she stops, and rearranged the flowers so that they would look nice as he
I
carried
actually
them.
don't know this story.
Typical
Isn't that crazy?
maternal, right? I love that
It's so
detail.
great. Yeah. It's that Mary
that's what a
actually
mother does.
stops him. He's just gathering up like flowers. So he's just got this bunch, and there's no order to them at all. He's just trying to hold them, and she stops him, takes the flowers and arranges them so that they're all lined up nicely and
Really?
neatly. So it creates an actual bouquet
Right.
instead of the pile that he had picked up.
Right.
And
So
she
now
wants to do that with our life.
Exactly.
Right? To
Yes.
help us. Yeah.
Yes, it's so beautiful. She just wants to rearrange and put it all in order for us. So that's kind of like,
And it's the order of charity that she wants, right? That's what's
Yes.
so often lacking in our works, that right order of love.
So if I were to ask for a tangible example beyond the picking up plants and making it a bouquet, right? It's the reordering of my spirit, kind of.
Right. That's right.
Right.
To what exactly? To
My intentions are
So there's the action towards us. I think Mary intercedes for us so that our intentions will be purified, so that
Right.
our
which
prayer
we
will be
then
purified.
offer.
Right. But then she also takes our prayer and she purifies it herself. She makes it look more pleasing, and so she offers the prayer that we have offered, but now she's cleaned it up on our behalf.
So it's it's on both ends. I'm sorry, doctor.
Right.
I keep,
Yeah, no,
I keep
that's so
interrupting you.
beautiful.
I'm sorry. But is it on both ends? It's like she prays for me, and therefore, right? Because I mean, for anyone that
Both
might feel
ends.
uncomfortable, we are assuming God's grace in all of this, right? Like none of it is separated from that, right?
Right.
But I only specify that because I know a lot of people do have intellectual difficulties with Marian consecration, you know? But it's Mary prays for me. It's like if she's all the way on the right, she's praying for me. I'm in the middle doing the thing that I now do better because of her prayers. And then when that gets offered to Christ, she also arranges them better on the left, figuratively speaking,
Yeah.
right?
But put Christ above you in this image. So you've got Mary on this side who you're asking, Mary, pray for me. She's interceding for you. It's Christ who's dumping that grace out upon you.
Right.
And so then your offering is being made more perfect. Meanwhile, she's there knowing your prayer,
Right.
knowing that which you are offering, and then purifying it and showing that purified
Right.
offering
And
to
that
Jesus.
arrangement is itself her prayer. It's all
Right.
her intercession.
Right.
Yeah, and by having a relationship with her, that helps our intentions from the inside out to be
Right.
rectified and purified.
Right.
Isn't that
I gotta
great?
say the rosary more.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, you do. Doctor, in your work in seminary formation, working with these men, not only to give them the sacramental theology understanding of the Eucharist, but then also connecting it to their liturgical celebration and to the way that they're going to offer Mass. Even though that's not your section
Right,
of the course. Right?
I delegate that to Father Schumer. It's
I
very
like the idea of
capable.
you delegating it to him. I think that's good. We're but when you talk to the men about how they will offer the Mass, how they will celebrate Mass, do you give them any advice, anything that you would say to them? Because there seems to be kind of a tension. On the one hand, if I'm the only one who can pray for the people in my life the way that I can pray for them on a personal level, Matt as a husband is the only one who can pray as a husband for his wife. As a father, he's the only one as a father who can pray for his son because his son has no other father, right? And so there can be, I think, maybe a temptation, and this is, I think we've experienced for a long time in the life of the church, for the priest to sort of want to pray as he can pray, as an individual, So if Sam Kachuba is the one who wants to pray as only Sam Kachuba can, then he's maybe approaching the Mass that way, and offering the Mass as only Sam Kachuba can offer Mass, which is a disaster, by the way. That's not the way it should be. And so we kind of have to balance the importance of the priest as the celebrant with his personal offering, and the fact that it doesn't matter how much I try to disappear into the role. My voice is always there, so there's a certain cadence to my voice, a certain way that I say certain words, that something of myself is always going to be in there. And yet what I find is that by not trying to insert myself into it too much, while still being personally involved, but while allowing the Mass to be the Mass, it becomes more perfectly the offering of Christ, because the words of the Mass are not mine.
Absolutely.
They're not mine to give. Furthermore, they become more perfectly the prayer of the Church. I'm bound more closely to the people who are praying at Mass, because I'm not praying my own prayer. I'm praying the prayer of the Church.
Right. So can I weigh in on that?
Please weigh in, yeah.
It seems to me it's a both and. So I totally agree. But so just, I'm up in the clouds here for a minute. Theoretically, it seems to me that the priest celebrating is at one and the same time acting in the person of Christ as ministerial priest, but you're also a member of the bride, and you don't stop being a member. In other words, baptism continues.
Right.
In other words, Holy Orders doesn't take away baptism, thanks be to God.
Yeah.
And so you're a member of the faithful, called to offer what's proper to you as the same as all of the. So St. Augustine said this in a beautiful way. He said, when he was made bishop, there was something that terrified him, and that was what he was for them. But there was something that consoled him, and that is what he was with them.
Right.
And that's expressing this. And so, yes, I think it's absolutely right that insofar as you're celebrating the person of Christ, you want to disappear, right? Don't call attention to yourself by doing idiosyncratic things, right? And focusing on your personality. No, you're to disappear so that Christ can be speaking through you and making present. But then your heart can't be absent, right? Your heart has to be just as present as that of all the faithful in bringing all of your desires, which you'll have proper to you for your parish, right? For all of the concerns of priestly ministry, for, say, priestly fraternity, for, again, what's proper to your life. So I think it's a both and in that way. And yes, I think the faithful will be aided in offering by both aspects, right? The faithful will be aided insofar as you let Christ shine and not Father Sam, but the faithful will be aided by your bringing your heart to it, because faith is contagious.
I find the more that I bring my heart, but not my personality.
Right.
The more I am able to celebrate well, the more the offering of the Mass is coherent, the more it makes sense. When I let myself get in there in terms of personality, not heart, but just like personality, something always feels off. Something always seems to go wrong.
Yeah.
And
it's that makes perfect sense. It demands, gifts demand humility, and the humility isn't denying that you got the gift. That's false humility. True humility is recognizing the gift, but precisely that it's a gift.
Well, it's
the
not gift
yours.
to be able to offer the Mass. Right.
Yeah.
Not like, it's not a talent that I have. It's not something that I've learned, like a great skill or developed it. Like there's a woman who after Mass, she'll come out and say hello, and she always kisses my hand. And in America, we don't have that custom, but she's not American. And so for her to kiss my hand is not that, well, she is an American now. She's a citizen, but she's not from the United States. Right. And when she kisses my hand, she did it one day, and somebody was with her who had never seen that before. I was like, why'd you do that? And she starts to explain it. I said, it's fine. And she goes, you don't mind? I really don't mind. It was a devotional, truly reverent thing that she was doing, not because of me as an individual, but because I am a priest and because of what I do. And when you can step into that space where it's not about me, and it can't be about me, then my own personal offering actually for me is even more profound, because that my own personal offering is there. And so another thing the pandemic got me doing was, because I had nothing but time since I wasn't distributing communion, I could give a little bit more at every Mass. I had another minute and a half that I could give. So I started using Eucharistic Prayer 1, the Roman Canon, even for daily Mass. And I can't stop doing it now, because the Roman Canon has the two pauses. There's the pause for the intention for the living, and for the intention for the dead. And since basically my intention for the dead is taken every day by whatever the parish Mass intention is, I have to pause there to pray for whoever the deceased person is that I've been asked to offer the Mass for. But then I have that intention for the living. And so every day to pause just at that moment, it's such a brief pause.
Yeah.
But to stop there and pray for the living, and there's two people in particular who I've been praying for every day for like a year, and just to pause there is
Thank you for praying for me.
Yeah.
But explain that to the faithful, right? Because
Yeah.
that way the faithful can join in at that moment.
That's yeah. No, you're right. I need to do that. Have you been watching my live stream or something? No. In the basement, in the God corner, he's watching my live stream.
I was frantically flipping through pages in your book this entire time, because there was a quote. It's at the very beginning of the book about how humility is hiding your gifts and talents so far as it doesn't injure your neighbors. Right? And that's like what you were talking about. How you said, and then you used the word talent, and I had a little like attack over here, because I was like, that's the word I'm looking for. But that struck me, because I heard on an episode of Pints with Aquinas once, that I don't know who the bishop was, but Matt Fradd was speaking about how a bishop allowed his hands to be kissed, and his response to, "Oh, that humble man," and I was like, humble. I was like, I don't understand how that represents. I trust that you're probably correct. You probably know more about humility than I do, But that sounds worse than I meant it to. But
I'll say something not humble. Matt Fradd once told me I had a great beard. Like
no hiding that talent.
No, the one time I had a chance to meet him, he was walking past me at some Catholic event, and he looked at me and said, "Great beard, Father." I was like, yes!
That was a pretty good Australian accent,
right,
too.
not
You got
bad.
better at it, yeah. But like that idea that humility hides itself insofar as it doesn't injure, those around you, and just how that applied to what you were speaking about. I was like, man, I gotta find this quote, and then I never did, so I brought it up anyway.
Have I mentioned that Matt Fradd story in the past on this podcast?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you have.
Okay, so I'm just going to keep doing it every so often, so that maybe he'll come on the podcast too someday. To
I've
talk
mentioned
to us. I think
4 or
that'd be really
5
fun.
times that Pittsburgh is the only town in America where every sports team shares the same colors. And I found that out because you told me on the air.
It's no, you just keep telling it as though it's a fact for me.
Yeah.
That's so perfect.
These are our inside jokes too.
Yeah. Now, okay, I want to change gears just slightly here, because there's a question that has been on my mind for a while. It's come up in several different places, even recently. I think that when Francis appointed soon-to-be Cardinal Fernandez as the prefect for the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, in his letter, he encouraged a cultivation of serious theology. And at a local Catholic university here, there's a professor who recently wrote an article, a very short article, asking basically what is the state of Catholic theology at an academic level, in the academy, especially in Catholic universities in the United States. And the answer that seems to keep coming up whenever this question gets posed is there seems to be a lack of recognizable names out there.
I don't think so.
So this is my question. What do you think the state of Catholic theology is in the academy, especially in the United States, but in the world? Like, what do you see happening?
Well, I don't know about the rest of the world. I know mostly the United States, but I see lots of good things happening. So just simply, I'm going to before answering about academic, let me say seminary theology, because I think that's even more important, because that's our. When I came, so I was a convert. I came into the church. I used to be an atheist. Came in 1980. I was baptized in 1988 in the Anglican Church. Went through RCA a few months later, and my wife and I were received into the Catholic Church in 1989. I wanted to study theology. I didn't know anything, so I went to the local seminary. And I found to my dismay that there were huge problems in the Catholic Theological Academy that I had no idea about, having been an atheist. And I was very distressed. So I was studying as a layperson in the local seminary where I used to live. And it wasn't good. It wasn't orthodox. And even I knew that just coming from atheism. And the seminarians were distressed by it. And today, seminaries in the United States are so much better, in such a better place than they were 30 years ago. And not just in academic formation, but in all four of the dimensions, right, that we speak about: intellectual, human, spiritual, and pastoral. And maybe the human formation is it's no less of the improvement. So I'm very encouraged in that. And then in the academy, I see, again, a huge flourishing of really excellent theologians. So I belong to lots of different theological associations, and I'm always edified by scholars old and young. So I'm a member of the Academy of Catholic Theology, founded by mostly by Matthew Levering, Father Thomas Joseph White. But Matt Levering he's a phenomenon. And then I'm a member of St. Paul's Center for Biblical Theology. And in fact, this book is published by their Emmaus Academic. And this Eucharist is a course from the St. Paul Center, founded by Scott Hahn. And Scott Hahn has, not only written countless books, as Matt Levering, but both of them are spectacular mentors of younger scholars. And so Scott Hahn so I was speaking at a priest conference with him a couple of weeks ago, and he mentioned that he has had 66 graduate students live in his house in the basement.
Oh, my goodness.
Over the years, since they bought that house in Steubenville. And these have become, professors teaching theology in the academy in all kinds of places, right? The Augustine Institute was probably dreamed of in Scott Hahn's basement, and so many other things. And Focus as well. Focus had its origin in Scott Hahn's basement. And so there's been a dissemination of scholarship that is orthodox and built on a living, seeking holiness and a living relationship with God in prayer. That is having huge effects. And it's too easy to get discouraged by looking out into the world and missing the good things that are happening.
And
that's my plug.
It's going further, too, because Franciscan is starting a PhD program next year, doctorate program.
Wow.
And one of the primary goals is that those who graduate from that doctoral program can then go teach at other.
Right. Yeah, and Ave Maria has been doing this.
Right.
And so, again, Matthew Levering and Father Lamb, he's passed away. They have done such great work. There's too many names. Mikhail Waldstein.
He was my professor in a class 3 weeks ago.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it was
admiration
amazing
for him.
Oh, he's brilliant.
Yeah, his work on John Paul II.
Yes,
and
it was
theology of the body.
A fun little story is that I'm in the master's in theology and Christian ministry program at Franciscan. I usually
don't worry,
do my
Franciscan
classes
University
online.
of Steubenville, Ohio. He knows the program that he's enrolled in. It's okay.
Yeah, it's good. I promise I do. It was just that I kind of got something stuck in my mouth, so it came out all gross. Again, I apologize to the listeners that are wearing headphones. But I usually take my classes online, but got a concussion the first week of class and couldn't take my class online, but ironically could read. Reading was totally fine, but couldn't look at a screen for the life of me. And said, you know what, you should read when you have a concussion, Theology of the Body. And so I picked up Professor Waldstein's book, and then one day into class realized who Professor Waldstein was. Just like didn't realize that he had written the introduction and only came to realize that I was reading his book and he was my professor.
You're the guy from my book.
When I went to go make a point from his book. I was like, can you elaborate your own words, I guess, for me, please? But it was
But in
awesome.
different words than the words that you wrote here.
Yeah, just help, please. But brilliant, man.
Yeah. Let me take it one step back. So I think this flowering that we're seeing in the U.S., I mean, has its root in a gift of God to the church, and that is John Paul II. I think he has been such a source of fruitfulness. And then the partnership he had with then Cardinal Ratzinger, right, as the head of the CDF, such a powerful collaboration. And then Pope Benedict succeeding John Paul II. That has been such a huge gift to the church, and we're seeing its fruit continue to expand. And there's reason to think that, I'm a half full person by temperament, but I think there's founded, I mean, that's, it's part of the gospel, it seems to me.
I'm glad to hear you talk about the seminary as one of the places in the academy, that the academic work that's being done by theologians teaching in seminaries is of value. I think very often the seminaries are not really considered as academic institutions. They're kind of put off to the side as there's academics, there's class, but it's different. It's not the same as what's done at the local Catholic university or something. And I think the more we can break that down so that there's not that distinction, so we actually see that the work, I think, in many ways done at the seminaries is often more academically rigorous than what's being done at the universities. And
right,
I think this is...
I find it very helpful teaching at a seminary to help me bring my theology to prayer. And that's going to, I mean, without that, theology has its foundation, right, in the
faith-seeking understanding, right. We have to pray.
And so teaching a theology helps me to put in context. All of this is meant, right, to grow the spiritual life, the human and the spiritual, precisely so it can be passed on to all the faithful. And that's the way in the academy we ought to do theology as well.
So this is exactly it. In the academy, there's a way that we ought to do theology. And I wonder sometimes, looking at, let's say your average Catholic university, not a Franciscan where they actually offer a theology major, but so many Catholic universities no longer offer theology as a major. They might have some courses in theology, but they don't have enough for it to be a major.
Religious studies.
It gets rolled into a religious studies course or into a Catholic studies concentration, often not even a major. There's not a lot of Catholic universities don't even have a major in Catholic studies. They have a concentration. And so there's not a method for how theology is taught. There's rarely even an introduction to Catholic theology. If there's an intro course, what that means is that you have people who aren't being exposed to the essential theology courses. Like they're not being given a fundamental theology course. They're not really learning the credibility of revelation. They're not learning these other things. They're thrown into maybe an overview course or a world religions course or a religious studies course that studies more the sociological phenomenon of religion, as opposed to the theology, the content of the faith. And so I'm glad to hear, because I know about Scott Hahn. I know about the Augustine Institute and these places, and I'm fortunate enough to know some of my own classmates teaching at Kenrick Glennon Seminary. To know some guys who are doing some of this really good work, but to know that there are people out there who are being strong. But how do we? I hate to use the word, but I'm going to say it this way anyway. How do we infiltrate the Catholic university so that they start offering theology again? So they start teaching this, because there is. Do you want a high five?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks. Okay. The hand was up. I couldn't tell if he was telling me to stop, like stop talking. That's enough, or if he wanted like a high five.
No.
Because if we started teaching theology according to a method. If we just introduced a little bit of logic into the methodology. I feel the same way about philosophy. I get really frustrated when I was a philosophy major in college because I was in college seminary, and I remember going from theology class to theology class, and at one point there was a guy I was at a Catholic university doing my undergrad degree, but I was living at the seminary, and during one of my philosophy classes there was a guy who was also in another class that I was taking, and it was his second philosophy class for the core requirement, so he had to have 2 philosophy classes. And so he tapped me on the shoulder on the first day of class and he goes, "I love philosophy." I said, "Really?" He goes, "Yes, second class I took in it." And he didn't know that I was a philosophy major and that I was in my 8th philosophy class at that point. And so he's, "Yeah, I love philosophy. You can just say anything and no one can tell you you're wrong." And I was like, I don't know how to tell you this, but that's wrong. You're wrong. That's not correct. And he didn't believe me until we had to hand in a paper a couple weeks later, and we handed it in, and we each had to, as we handed it in, give a 30-second snapshot of what we wrote about. So I gave my 30-second snapshot, and the professor goes, "Okay, let's see how that went." Takes my paper. Then this guy hands in his paper and gives his 30-second snapshot. And the professor just looks at him and goes, "This is going to be a disaster," and walks away. Because the guys, he made no sense for 30 seconds. I thought it was great. But we don't do this with philosophy. We don't teach people how to think. We don't give them survey courses in philosophy that show them the history of philosophy.
Yeah.
And so then, absent a history of philosophy, they jump from philosophy 101 to existentialism, and then they think that nothing is true and they can just do whatever they want.
Well, that's how I started, Father. So I was an atheist. I was at Washington University in St. Louis, and my first philosophy class was on Nietzsche. And so I bought the complete works. I ended up studying junior year abroad in Germany. We bought the complete works of Nietzsche in German. Right. I haven't consulted it recently. So yeah, it's just totally, we do things totally upside down.
Yeah. I read an article when there was one famous theologian in the U.S., when she retired, she gave an interview, and in the interview they said, asked her how she felt teaching undergrads today. And she said, "Well, I recently had a student. He was a freshman in college, and he came to me after class with some questions. He said he didn't really understand his Catholic faith. So I gave him this book by Hans Kung. And I told him to read it. And I'm thinking, what kind of crazy person gives a freshman in college a book by Hans Kung? The Germans are still trying to figure out what Hans Kung said, and he said it in German. He's also not a very credible theologian. He's got some very questionable views, and he's speaking in extremely complicated things. Yeah. This guy doesn't understand something. Hans Kung isn't going to explain a thing to him. I'm thinking that's just bad teaching. Right. And I get critical of that. I mean, I'm East Coast, so
I did the same thing. That was at the beginning of our conversion experience. One of my first books was Hans Kung, Why I'm Being a Christian, or Why Be a Christian, something that's to the effect. And my impression after finishing the book was, why is he a Christian? But so it didn't help me.
It didn't answer you any questions.
It showed me that there was a problem out there in the academy. But again, I'm really encouraged today because people at the seminary, nobody asks about that. Right? They want real meat that can help them to teach the faithful.
Yeah.
To me, there's such a need in the church for adult faith formation.
Yes.
Right? We think that we got enough preparing for confirmation. And it's got to be a lifelong thing. Just so I find it's very helpful to relate it to what do I do for my professional work? Mm-hmm. Right? So a doctor has to keep on studying. And so our whole life, if I do that for a secular profession, how much more I ought to do that for the royal priesthood, right? And for living a Eucharistic life.
I like how you brought it back to the Eucharist. That was a good move there. Way to go. That's really clever.
We drifted too far.
I know. It's good. It's good.
There is never too far.
Well, that's great. Dr. Feingold, thank you.
Thank you.
This is so
good. That was great fun.
Love to talk with you about this. So the book is The Eucharist, Mystery of Presence, Sacrifice, and Communion. It's available from the Emmaus Academic. So check out St. Paul Center for Biblical Studies, and you'll find it there.
It's available as a course as well.
Oh, tell us about the course then.
Yeah, so the course
give
is
us the commercial.
Taken from the book. So you can, the viewers can find out about that by going to the St. Paul Center website and look up Emmaus Academy. And there are at least a dozen courses, Scott Hahn and John Bergsma and many others, and they're all excellent. And what they're doing is taking these big fat books and making them more accessible to the faithful. And so my course on the Eucharist is 12 talks of about a half an hour. I had trouble keeping myself to 30 minutes, some are 35, but basically 12 segments of 30 to 35 minutes covering the highlights of the book. And kind of going through what we've spoken about.
Can I ask you a question about the Emmaus Academy?
Yeah.
Do you have on Emmaus Academy a course for RCIA, for instruction for people coming into the church?
I don't think so, not at the moment. That's a great idea. I love teaching. So I teach RCA every year here in St. Louis at the cathedral.
Your cathedral
that must
is
be
gorgeous.
one heck of an RCIA.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Your cathedral, though, is beautiful.
Yeah, and I'm doing a Zoom RCA for people from a Jewish background. So if you know anyone who's interested, they can find out at the Googling the Association of Hebrew Catholics. And I actually have a whole series of free talks on that website, Association of Hebrew Catholics. Because I come from a Jewish background. My dad was a Jewish atheist. So I grew up an atheist, but from a Jewish perspective.
Wow. We should have you back. You could just talk about that.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for giving us your time. This is amazing.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It's
been a great pleasure.
Yes, for us too. Believe me.
Well, this is The Tangent. I'm Father Sam Kachuba.
I'm Matt Sperrazza.
And our guest today was Dr. Lawerence Feingold.
Hey, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you'd like to further support The Tangent, please consider subscribing or following on your preferred platform, following us at @thetangent_Catholic on Instagram, or even donating at veritascatholic.com. See you next time. God bless.